I can share it.
Welcome from my side as well. My name is Christian Jakob. I'm a journalist and I will be moderating. As has been mentioned before, the war that broke out 2 years ago has brought a humanitarian catastrophe of historic proportions upon the people of Sudan. Hunger, displacement, disease and death have been spreading at a shocking rate. The numbers had been already mentioned by Oliver, and yet this war has much more to do with us than most people might realize. Because after decades of dictatorship and civil war in Sudan, it was the EU that had rehabilitated Sudan's internationally obstreized dictator and war criminal Omar al-Bashir in 2016 and developed him as a border protection partner. His man for the rough job has also benefited from this, General Hemeti, the butcher of Darfur and the leader of the RSF militias. Since then, the militias and Hemeti had become increasingly stronger and then tried to seize power in the country by force after the overthrow of Bashir in 2019. The war thus also has its roots in the actions of our societies in Europe. So tonight we want to talk about the consequences of the war for the people in Sudan and on the refugee routes. How can those responsible for the war crimes and human rights violations be held accountable? What future awaits the country after recent reports that the government army SAF seems to be militarily prevailing? And how can people be supported by the civil society here from us? So we want to talk about this today with the panelists who had already been introduced by Andreas. So I want to keep it short. However, I'm very pleased that you were able to make it to Berlin tonight. So Mossad Ali from the African Center of Justice and Peace Studies. He's a human rights lawyer and a conflict resolution specialist. And he previously has served as a director of the Amel Center for the Treatment and Rehabilitation of Victims of Torture in South Darfur and Sudan. And he has in 2006 been awarded the Olaf Palme Human Rights and Peace Prize for being an outspoken and courageous critic of crimes against human rights. Welcome. Yeah. Caroline Bußmann, she's a lawyer and she's a coordinator of the United Nations fact-finding mission in Sudan. She joined the United Nations in 2019 before she was an asylum lawyer in the Netherlands. After 2019, before she went to Sudan, she was working in Iraq in UNITAD, the commission investigating the crimes, human rights crimes of Daesh in Iraq. Welcome as well. And Shima Sami, she's a journalist from Cairo in Egypt, and she has been spending quite a bit of time in Germany, also with Borderline Europe, and she's working for the NGO Madad that is offering support for minority women, migrants and refugees in Egypt. Welcome. So maybe for a start, Mossad, for 2 years now, the anniversary, so to say, will be the 15th of April. The Rapid Support Forces under General Hemeti and the Sudanese armed forces have been fighting each other. And what is the current state of this war and what is the situation for the civilian population in Sudan at the moment?
Thank you so much and thank you everyone for being here. And actually, yes, you are right. This is maybe the second anniversary of the war that have been erupted in April 15, 2023. And it has been described actually as the worst humanitarian disaster in the globe. Simply actually because, you know, the crimes that have been committed actually during this war were very systematic and also it's like a widespread. The humanitarian part of it actually has been actually mentioned here I mean, in terms of the number of those who have been displaced or have been forced migrated internally or even cross the border to the neighboring countries, actually, it's huge. It could be actually like a half population. The Sudanese population actually like 46 million, but 25 millions of them actually, they have been either displaced internally or, externally across the border to the neighboring countries. This is actually beside the atrocities that has been actually committed against them, starting from indiscriminate attacks against civilians. I mean, this include like extrajudicial killing, arbitrary arrest and detention, forced migration, and I think my colleague Caroline, she's going to elaborate on that in depth. But however, I think as a humanitarian situation is actually maybe the area of great concern, because actually all of the Sudanese people who are inside Sudan now, actually, they are in pressing need, to any kind of humanitarian assistance. Yes, it is true that there were a number of attempts, whether within the region or internationally, to provide or to deliver humanitarian assistance to those who are in need. But unfortunately, nothing has happened yet. Yes, it has been said that actually there are a number of obstacles to ensure that there are some safe corridors, to ensure a safe delivery or protection of the humanitarian workers, but actually that has not achieved yet, despite the fact that there were a number of attempts, to reach to any kind of ceasefire agreement between the two warring parties through a number of initiatives and through a number of platforms. But none of these actually platforms or none of these forums actually has managed to reach to any kind of agreement. And that actually has reached the level to Sudan to be declared, as a country that facing a hunger and starvation. And this actually according to UN, and especially, within the IDPs communities and also within the entire country. And
everybody knows IDPs, internally displaced persons, so refugees inside the country.
Yes, the internally displaced people, those people who actually fled their places of origin to another place within the country. It could be, for example, like displacement camps. It could be like schools. It could be any shelter in a relatively safe place. For the time being, actually, I can't say that actually there are safe places in Sudan. Maybe previously, during the first round of the wars in Sudan, in back 2000s, there may be actually some areas within Sudan actually that has not been affected by the war. But now, actually the entire country has been affected. Yes, it's relatively, some of them are stable to some extent, but also the situation is fragile, and actually they could be exposed, to the hunger, to the violations, by both parties, by rapid support forces, by Sudanese armed forces. So this, they have just migrated, to seek safe haven within the country. But actually the rest have decided actually even to cross the border, despite the fact that they don't have even, the financial support or the capacity. So actually they managed to make it by different difficult means, to reach there. And even after they cross the border, also they are still, facing these difficulties, and they are still actually suffering, to survive. And I think my colleague here also could elaborate more about maybe the situation of the refugees in the neighboring countries as well. So this could be like in brief, the general human rights, the general humanitarian situation looks like.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe we could indeed continue with the neighboring countries. Shima, Sami, you are working in Egypt. I think it has been mentioned before, roughly 3.4 million Sudanese did flee to Egypt. And the legal and the humanitarian situation for them is precarious, to say the least. Could you maybe give, for the beginning, a little overview on the situation of the Sudanese refugee population in Egypt?
Yeah, first, thank you everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Maybe I should give a brief background about Egypt's situation in the beginning before I go deep into the Sudanese refugees, because Egypt have a complicated situation related to political issues, economy, and we have a lot of issues related to freedom in general. So you can imagine if you are a refugee coming from a war zone to a neighbor country, you used to go to it easily. but now you are coming in a bad situation to a country which is having her own bad situation as well. So it's more complicated for the Sudanese refugees in general, but especially for women. I can say it's really complicated because we don't have an asylum law in Egypt. We used to call them only guests in the formal speeches, which is give them a current situation that they can have good hospitality, but they don't have any rights. And we deal with the situation of the migrant in Egypt as they are having their rights to eat, to find a place to sleep, but they don't have the right to speak, to get involved in any kind of work even, or to have any kind of other rights related especially to minorities or women. Currently in Egypt, the government came out with a new law related to asylum, which is a good step forward. However, up to now, this law don't have exclusive relegation, so it's not working up to now on the ground. We have some issue related to this law as well, that they don't mention minorities, they didn't mention women issues at all, and we have some suspicions that this law will be used to control migrants, not to protect them, because it's related as well with the terrorism law in Egypt, which this terrorism law, we have a lot of problem with it because it have been used to control the freedom of speech and a lot of political prisoners related to this law already. So now it's involved with the asylum law, and we are a little bit suspicious as NGOs and civil rights workers that maybe it will affect the refugees and migrant situation in a negative way, not in a positive way. But we are hoping that maybe in the future it will be changed a little bit, because up to now, after a lot of argument related to this law, it have been stopped. So maybe they take time to continue working on it in a better way. Back to the question about the situation of the Sudanese refugees in Egypt related to humanitarian or legal situation, it's really complicated because most of the women who came from the war, I will talk especially about women, but of course it's in general, most of the Sudanese people who came from the war, suffering from trauma, suffering from medical health issues, they have a very long trip from Sudan into Egypt. Rather, they came through a legal or illegal way. And in Egypt, we don't have a good health care system in general, especially related to minorities or to the people who are foreigners or migrant or whatever you will call them. And now it's more and more complicated because they don't have an easy process to have a legal paper situation in. So most of them, they don't have the legal papers, so they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to education, and as well, they don't have access to do legal work, whatever kind. So it's a little bit upcoming problems related to what should they do next. If we didn't, as a government or as an NGO, offered accessibility to secure way to work, and to have health care, and to have to protect the minorities especially and women, what should they do? Also, maybe we can back to the issue that a lot of Sudanese people, especially men in this case, have been under detention or have been deported from the Egyptian authorities, even if they have the legal paper or they have a card from the UN says that he is having asylum addressed. But the police in Egypt don't take the international asylum as serious. They want national paperwork says that you have the right to stay in Egypt. So we're hoping by the asylum law Egypt now have that this will be fixed, but up to now it's still going. And most of them, after they get detained, they are not allowed to enter Egypt in the legal way, so they have to enter by the illegal way because they separated from their families. The women and children stays in Egypt, and the men get arrested and pushed back to Sudan, so they have to return to their families in the end of the day. So I can't say that there is any kind of violation the Sudanese refugees don't face in Egypt. You can imagine even Egypt is part of Africa and we have brown skin, but yet we consider, most of the Egyptians consider themselves that they are not African and they consider themselves that they are not black or brown skin, which came through history, and it's very complicated issue, but it's now affect the Sudanese comers because they facing discrimination, they facing a lot of hate speech coming out from the society itself, or in certain point from the media or the government itself, actually. But maybe in the last year, I can see, or not the last year, but in the last couple of months, I can see a little improvement in the Egyptian government behavior, and I think it's related somehow with EU. Maybe we can come to this next. So yeah, this is well, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it would be nice if you could elaborate a bit on the EU role in it, because Egypt has been the country who had been awarded, so to say, the largest amount of compensation for a migration agreement. In 2024, in June, Ursula von der Leyen signed this migration agreement with Egypt. Of course, part is Egypt's obligation to prevent the refugees from Gaza and from Sudan to continue their journey towards Europe, and 7.4 billion euro have been put on the table, split it into different budgets. And how far is this money directly affecting the situation for migrants and refugees in Egypt, maybe in general, and particularly for Sudanese?
Okay, I will be honest about this. Everyone knows about the economy problems we are facing in Egypt, especially in the last decade, under the new strategy of economy coming from Sisi. And anything related to money, we as civil society workers or journalists, I am a little bit unsure that this will be spent in the right place. So it's around 1 year now since we have this agreement, and I didn't see true impact on the life of the refugees and the migrants in Egypt, rather than coming from Palestine or from Sudanese refugees. I didn't see true impact. Up to now, I can say, okay, they spend the money on this or on that. And the other issues, the main issues maybe in this agreement, that we as the civil society or NGOs, we don't have any kind of, we don't get engaged on this. We don't have the power to not to control, but at least to see, to get involved, to work with them. In Egypt, we don't have the freedom to do this now, in a way or another. And when we hear that there is a lot of money coming from Europe to Egypt, we have a big question usually. It will be spent on the humanitarian stuff, or the regime will try to rescue themselves from the economic crisis they are facing, and it will not go to the current channel on the agreement. So, as I said, a year to the agreement, and up to now, I can't see a true impact. Otherwise, I see the effect of this agreement on, as I said, on the media. The first, when this war began, the first I started to work with Sudanese refugees, we had some pattern of hate speech coming out from the government itself. Some of the official media channel have hate speeches against the Sudanese refugees on one way or another. Maybe they didn't understand that this is discrimination, but at the end of the day, it was very bad. Now, in the last 3 or 4 months, we don't see such kind of behavior. We don't see the government used to use the Sudanese comers as the reason of the bad economy. they used to say the reason that we have high prices or the rent get increased or whatever bad stuff happening in the country, it's because of the comers from Sudan. In the last couple of months, I can't see this anymore. So, of course, I don't know if you know this, but the media in Egypt is totally controlled by the regime as well. We don't have, I can't say we don't have a free media platform except one or two. So, general speech, we can say that this agreement affected directly the strategy of the Egyptian regime, how they deal in public with the migrant and refugees. But the money itself, I don't see it impact up to now. We didn't see any true activity related to humanitarian stuff. And we can't ask even about it. So maybe I can't ask Egypt, but I can ask Europe at least. Does they follow up this money? Does they know in what channels has been spent? Or can we track the money down to make sure that it helped the people who really in need to this money?
Thank you. Caroline, you have been appointed as a coordinator of the fact-finding mission of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Sudan, which was set up, I think, in October 2023. So you've been spending 1.5 years now, more or less. There were difficulties concerning the question whether you could enter the country, but you did gather evidence on human rights violations in this war so far. Could you give us a brief overview and insight of the extent of war crimes and human rights violations that you have been getting knowledge of so far?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your interest for this discussion tonight. Indeed, it's not been 1.5 years because we were recruited 6 months with 6 months delay because of a UN liquidity crisis. So we actually came as the secretariat in Nairobi mid-May, and then we had to report in September. Now we're going to have another reporting moment in September again, and there will be some oral update. But in September, and later we elaborated in October, we found very, very shocking violations on both sides. On the south side, the Sudanese army, they're more an air force, so they have been involved a lot in, you already mentioned it, indiscriminate bombardments. Some are not as indiscriminate as others, but when we talk about indiscriminate, we mean that there's like maybe one military objective that they may be focusing on in a civilian area. But we've also seen very, very targeted attacks on hospitals, on IDP camps, the displaced people camps, also on markets. And so what we've seen on both sides, that there's been a deliberate destruction of the civilian infrastructure. The RSF, and they're both working with different allied militias, and so they also have been very cruel on the ground. The RSF is more a ground troop. So when we look at the widespread looting, like that was really the RSF. Also very, very widespread sexual violence, and that was mainly rape, gang rape. We also now have forced marriages, and we have some cases of sexual slavery. This was mainly on the RSF side, but we have some incidents also on the Sudanese army side. And what we've seen, so in September, like the majority of the violations came from the from the RSF, but now we see, like, first of all, the situation is getting worse by the day. And also we've seen that there is a bit of a change in dynamics. So as already was mentioned, the Sudanese army is coming back, is attacking. And we've seen very, very, very serious casualties in El Fasher, in Darfur, and also in Khartoum. And a lot what happens next after they retake areas, then there is revenge killings. There's been like mass executions in streets. But also a lot of arbitrary detention, or not so arbitrary sometimes. A lot of people are being arrested. Again, this is both sides, often in revenge. But everyone who is like placed in in an area under control of the other side is seen with suspicion. Even and we'll talk about that more, but even the sexual violence often was targeted. Those women who were involved in the demonstrations even before the conflict started, a lot of them have been targeted. Those who have been involved in documenting human rights violations on either side have been targeted for sexual violence, for arbitrary detention, and for torture. Also, what we've seen, and you already talked about it, the impact of the war, but the impact for a very, very large extent is man-made. We are talking about very, very serious food insecurity and even starvation. People are dying. And some of that is a consequence of the war, but a lot of it is man-made. And you see in some of the camps, for instance, near El Fasher, there's some camps, people are like deliberately blocked from getting any access to food or water. And as I already said, the infrastructure is being destroyed, so there is no food. And whatever there is 10 times the price. So it's really, really difficult for them to gain anything. What you also see is that humanitarian assistance from also from UN agencies, from CSOs, like this is all blocked. And sometimes it's because nobody's taking responsibility. There's too many different armed fractions now all over Sudan, and they're all involved in violations of human rights. And this is a situation that really, like, we all need to work on to at least negotiate with both these warring parties to open the doors that people can have at least access to the basic needs. Also hospitals, medical care, like nothing is there. And one last point, what you said about Egypt is also very true for Sudan. They've really blocked people from speaking out, from accessing situations, information, etc. So, and again, that's man-made. I think these are, and children have been used, especially by the RSF, in their fighting. They've been recruited as child soldiers. They've also been detained and really been subjected to very serious violations, including torture. And both women and children have been very disproportionately affected by the war. And also, as I said, markets. It's mostly women who've been targeted by a lot of these bombardments. I think I leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There's one question I would like to raise. You mentioned humanitarian assistance. US aid has been at least ceased its operations to a large extent. In how far has this affected the situation in Sudan and in the surrounding countries that have been receiving refugees from Sudan?
Yeah, I thank you so much. It's unfortunately a very critical situation because almost 50% of the humanitarian aid was supported by US aid. So we have a lot of, common kitchens that were set up to actually try to help these people who really have no access to food. And in Khartoum, there's about 90 that have closed. Half of them all over the country have closed. So now the situation is even more critical because the basic needs, also there's some medical assistance that USAID supported, and now there's no access. So it's a very, very critical situation at this stage.
Has it been blocked 100% the funds, or did a bit come in, or how was it concretely?
Well, there was some exception for the immediate humanitarian aid, but at the moment, this is, so it's very difficult for people are very confused how to actually apply for the exception, how to actually get it. So the reality is that it's all frozen, but there's going to be, and they're working on it, and they also freed up some funds. But then, to actually get it to where it's most needed, that's where it's still, problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mossad, Caroline has been mentioning the human rights violations and the war crimes. You're also working on that. I would like to know, you're based in Kampala in Uganda. How is it possible for a civil society institution like you collect evidence on these war crimes, on these human rights violations? How do you actually do this, and what's happening then with the data and information you're collecting?
Yes, this is actually very true. I think the documentation of the human rights crimes one of the biggest challenges, not only for us as civil society organizations that works on documentation of human rights violations, but even to the fact-finding missions. I mean, the UN fact-finding missions, the AU fact-finding mission itself. And for an organization that work from exile, actually it's really very hard. But maybe because you have like a different experience when it comes to the collection of evidence or taking testimonies from the victims, it could be even traced back, to the early 2009. And especially during the situation in Darfur, because actually, just for your information and for the all this information, this is not actually the first war in Sudan. There were a number of wars in Sudan where mass atrocities has been committed in South Sudan, in Darfur, in Blue Nile, in Kordofan. But the Darfur case actually could be also, or has been also characterized as one of the biggest catastrophe actually in the world, where there was war crimes and genocide has been committed. During that time, also it was really very difficult, in terms of justice and accountability, for the national, the international level, to get access to the evidence, whether material evidence or even any any kind of evidence. So there was always a reliance on civil society organizations, UN agencies, human rights activists and defenders within the territory of the country, so as to facilitate, the collection of this evidence. So we have had that experience actually in early 2000s, where the International Criminal Court had started to investigate the situation of Darfur. So through our involvement actually in that investigation, the organization has been closed along with 18 international organizations and expelled from the country. And that is why actually we moved out to establish and to start this African Center from Nairobi, and also it's registered in New York, United States, and in London, the UK. So from that time, actually, we managed to develop like a system of collecting this information with a very low profile by relying on different networks of human rights defenders. I mean, from different backgrounds and different categories, like journalists, lawyers, women groups, students, youth groups, by training them on how to collect and document the crimes properly so as to be used, for any potential persecution, whether within the country or even outside the country. So by keeping this very low profile and also by following a very restrictive security protocol, to ensure the safety, the personal safety of the documenters themselves, and also the safety of the source of the information, whether the victims, the survivor, or the families, actually it could be considered as one of the top priorities. This is besides the regular training. I mean, we train them in regular basis on how to develop even, this protective system, because also it's like a dynamic in how to protect yourself, against any potential crackdown. So through these actually networks who have been well trained, to work in such circumstances, has actually helped a lot, to contribute to the sharing of information and data about what's happening. But since the war has erupted in 15th of April 2023, actually the situation has changed dramatically, and even the challenge had become even more bigger, and even had become actually more difficult, simply because even those who use actually to document, I mean those human rights defenders and these different networks have been affected by this war, and they themselves actually they become like victims of this war. So they fled their places of origin, either to remote areas, or some of them actually have fled the country to outside. So the remaining number who are still inside Sudan, despite the fact that also there are very few, but also, there are some technical barriers as well. For example, there is no any stable power or electricity in most part of the country. There is, and also the instability on the internet network itself also, affect to a very large extent, to access information, from outside, and so as to be shared, through the different secure platforms. So the challenges are there. Therefore, so the information that actually has, reached out and has been published, either by the African Center or by the others, actually could represent, a very small percentage of what's really happening in the ground. So this huge number that has been reflected actually could be just a small portion of what's really happened due to all these difficulties.
The scope of your work is the entire range of human rights violations, but there's one particular project, the one you're collaborating with Borderline, which is on forced disappearances. I thought it was focused on forced disappearances of refugees and migrants, but you told me before it's all kind of forced disappearances in Sudan. Could you elaborate a bit on this? To which extent has this been used by the two war parties, and which parts of the population does that affect? And is there anything known about the fate of the victims?
Well, the practice of enforced disappearance actually in Sudan, it's not like a new practice, but it has become widespread after the war erupted, as I said, in 2023. And we have paid much more attention to this crime of enforced disappearance because it has like more than one dimension. And even those who have been affected or those who are affected by this enforced disappearance, not only the victim or the survivor, but even, the entire family of the victims, because, they suffer on a daily basis in a situation of uncertainty. They are not sure, whether this whether this enforced disappeared family member, if he's alive, if he has been killed, if he has been executed, if he has been detained, he has been tortured. And even, with specific cases, where there are information, for example, about whereabouts of a few of them, also there are a number of other violations, that would be, interlinked with this enforced disappearance. It started from this arbitrary arrest, without having access, to your family or to a lawyer, or even to have like an official charge against you. This is, besides the torture, the ill treatment, besides the execution, because sometimes there are summary execution, and they are extrajudicial killing. So for that reason, actually, we have paid much more attention to this crime. And as I said, also, it becomes like widespread because, both parties now, they started, to either kidnap, arrest, and detain, people just, for suspicion that they are supporting the other war party. For example, the rapid support forces, whenever they come across any person that actually maybe just has, let's say, Islamic political background, or even if he, for example, affiliated to a specific region in Sudan. So that means actually he'd be targeted, that actually he may be to some extent, supporting the Sudanese armed forces, or he may be actually backing up, the Sudanese armed forces because he's affiliated to the Islamic movement. And the other way around, the Sudanese armed forces will never find any person from his pitch, from his general feature, that he may be, for example, from Western Sudan, okay, from his language, from his general feature. Also, he'd be actually exposed, to detention, to torture, to all kinds of these violations. So for that number, actually, so both sides, they have a huge number of suspects, that or their potential supporters, or they are spies, under different allegations. In addition to that, the detention facilities, has because the official both of them actually, even before the war, they have their own intelligence, and also they have their own security, and also they have their own detention facilities. And because the number has been increasing rapidly, so even they establish or they start to use like the public premises, like the hospitals, the public buildings, and the private houses as detention centers. Most recently, actually, after the Sudanese armed forces entered Khartoum a couple of weeks ago, there were a number of war prisoners and detainees amount to 4,000. This is just like in one or two places, and there are others who are still, their whereabouts is unknown. So just forget about, those who are from the side of the Sudanese armed forces with their intelligence bureau, with the military intelligence, and also the Islamic militias who actually back up the Sudanese armed forces. Also, they have their own intelligence and they have their own detention centers, So the number is really very big, and even, it's difficult even to predict the number, because the information that actually we have managed to collect together with borderline actually also could be like a very small portion. For example, because we are just like a medium-sized organization, we have documented like thousands of cases of enforced disappearance, and we have been communicating this actually with the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearance, since Sudan has joined the convention during the political transitional period in 2018 until 2021. So now actually they are involved in this issue.
Thank you very much. Shima, probably many of the families that you're working with in Egypt have relatives or friends who encountered this kind of atrocities. Are there any possibilities that these people have, or ways in which they try to find out anything on people they lost, be it in detention, be it when they were fleeing? Is there any open channel to get information, to try to contact the authorities or the war parties?
There is huge problem because, as I mentioned, in Egypt, we can say in general, we don't have any open channels to do any kind of such kind of work, but yet we managed to have other ways to survive and to try to get information. So of course, every Sudanese family in Egypt, most of them, they lost someone in the war. Maybe I will be saying that the lucky one who knows what exactly happened to their loved one, but most of them, they are not sure if they are still alive or dead, or what happened exactly to them. Of course, with forced disappearing issue, I can't say it's not relative to Egypt situation as well, but you can say that it's different pattern when we talk about forced disappearing in Egypt related to Sudanese migrant and refugees. It's a little bit different pattern than what's really happening with the Egyptian related to this matter. For the Sudanese people, they more need to get to know their rights and to get to know to the Egyptian law, and more they need to get legal aid, a lot of legal aid actually. In Madad, we offer free legal aid assistance, and more are coming to ask about how they can get information about the loved one who have been disappeared or who have been arrested, rather in Sudan or in Egypt or on the border between both countries. So they are not sure in which side exactly they are now. Most of the time, we have our legal ways to go through the process. We can ask the Egyptian government. We can send letters in formal ways to get information. But to be honest, it's not working. Most of the time, we don't get any kind of reply from the authorities in Egypt. And if we try to get contact with Sudan, we don't have a government now in Sudan, of course. So usually we work through NGOs such as maybe the African Centers or any other initiative we know in Sudan. We share the information, we share the family history, and where the last point we saw the man or the woman, and what we suspect that may happen to him related to his, as Mr. Mossad mentioned, related to his background, if he is coming from certain place, so maybe he will be related more to get involved with problems with the army or with Janjaweed. So it's very complicated, and I can't say that we have achieved a lot of successful cases related to this, except maybe one case. We knew that the young man has been pushed back to Sudan, and he has been arrested by the borders, on the borders, trying to get back to Egypt. And that's it. We knew where he has been, that he has been arrested, and we gave him the legal aid he needed. But most of the cases, no, we don't get any kind of open channels, and this is maybe one of the main issue we are facing, and we are trying to get more and more help related to this, because as Mr. Mossad mentioned, when you talk about forced disappearing, you don't talk only about the person who have been disappeared. You talk about not only the whole family and friends and relative, but actually the whole society. It's not like 2025 that people can just disappear. People can just vanish, and you don't know what really happened to them. At least people need to know the truth. If they have been killed during the war, if something bad happened, whatever it is, knowing this, it's much more better than just not to know anything, because we see a lot of women who have sons or husband who has been disappeared, and she can't, as we say, turn the page. And if it's her husband, she don't know if she still married or not. Should she take decision related to her family, her life in the future all by herself, or she just have to wait until the husband shows up and be partner on this process? And of course, it's more complicated with the legal process of even money processing. So if the man who had been provided to the family has disappeared and he held all the bank account for the family, they can't get the money now, because on the paper he's still alive and he's responsible for this bank account, so they don't have the chance even to move on and to do whatever was planned with this money. So it's very complicated. And in Egypt law, after certain years, you can go and raise a case to ask the government to consider this person that he is dead after certain years of disappearing. And yeah, the government can say, okay, he's dead on the paper, but does it really resolve the emotional attached with the family? Does it really resolve the idea that there has been a person just vanished and no one know what really happened to him? With forced disappearing or with this issue, most of the time it's related more to the men more than women. Women, maybe we can speak about sexual violent more, but it impacts women as men, because as I mentioned, she's a mother, she's a wife, she's a daughter, and someone important in her life just vanished. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
Thank you. Carolyn, speaking about accountability and responsibility, I would like to know from you, in case everything turns out well, you're able to collect information and gather evidence, what is the perspective of the use of this information? In which institutional way this evidence should be taken, for example, to prosecute criminals of war. And the question related to this is, we've been speaking about this before, you said, of course, it's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and as everyone knows, the pressure under which the ICC has become in the recent past has increased a lot. More and more countries either pulling out of it, like yesterday Hungary, or are somehow questioning the authorities. So one could argue that it got weakened. And what does this mean for the chances of taking the evidence you could gather and taking to court the ones responsible for the war crimes?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, it is true that at the moment, the only court we can really look at to share information with is the International Criminal Court. By our mandate, we share even with NGOs if they really have a mandate to work on accountability, because it is part of our mandate to actually take that extra step. Also with national jurisdictions we could share, but at the moment this is not happening. The Sudanese suspects are traveling around, but not so much to countries where they actually use universal jurisdiction like Europe, but they're more in neighboring countries. And politically, at this stage, I cannot see an investigation being launched in one of those countries. But that can change. Because political situations change. So that is definitely something that we are working on to collect. We're collecting evidence to also build cases against persons we have identified to have been involved in international crimes. This is in any event a very, very difficult process for the CSOs, or like civil society, for UN fact-finding missions, as well as for the International Criminal Court. It is in any event challenging to not only document the crime base, but also link the crimes to the actual perpetrators, especially if they're not the ones directly committing the acts, but if they're what I would say the perpetrator behind the perpetrator. So this is a challenge that we all face. And the International Criminal Court has had jurisdiction only for one part in Darfur, not for the entire Sudan. That's also a limitation. One of the recommendations that we made was to expand this, but realistically, you need the Security Council, and at this stage, you won't get an agreement on that. So that's another issue, unless Sudan would say, okay, we accept jurisdiction over the entire country. But for now, like there was a moment of cooperation, but until today, the people who've already been indicted 20 years ago, including al-Bashir, have not been surrendered to the court. So already it's a challenging situation. I know that the team working on Sudan is now really looking at the current situation. But even if they were to issue indictments, this could be something that were under seal or public. They did say, the prosecutor made an announcement that they're working on it and that they would issue indictments. So I do think this is happening. But then, leaving aside, I'll come back to that question, but even like already the establishment is difficult to collect enough evidence to bring a case on international crimes against anyone. But then you need these persons also to be surrendered to the International Criminal Court. That's not happening for now, but that might change. So you need to have the long vision, I think, when we are working on accountability for Sudan, because 20, 30 years, there have been conflict after conflict, and there has been no accountability, which is also part of what we're looking at as root causes of this conflict. So we really need to look at this, but it's incredibly challenging. So the ICC is now also under pressure because a lot of people are afraid, especially there's some US employees. Some have actually already left, or they really don't want to be on the forefront. Like one actually is working on Sudan. He's American. He was nowhere to be seen. So there is definitely that impact. Then also the non-Americans don't know yet how far it's going to go. So yes, there's going to be that situation. But I think in general, it's just a very, very, very difficult situation at the moment. the Sudanese, like they can also not access. We cannot access Sudan. A lot of us cannot access Sudan, but the ICC cannot access Sudan either. So what you were saying about, you know, the limited information that we have, this applies to all of us. And also that's why we all kind of need to work together towards the collection of evidence. So in some, for now, it's the only court that we can deal with, but we are firmly hoping that that situation will change. There's some cases that are being brought before national jurisdiction for like businesses, against businesses, but it's for crimes before this conflict. So it's outside the scope of our mandate, but it does seem that there is some, you know, there is some movement there. There's like a case in Sweden, and they're working on some other cases. So maybe the business entities is where we need to go. Yeah, thank you.
I have two more questions on this. So one is you mentioned the UN Security Council, which includes Russia, and strangely enough, Russia has been on both war party sides. So the Wagner Group, the Africa Corps, has been supporting the RSF, and Russia officially has been supporting the Sudanese National Army. What does this mean for any attempt to hold the war parties responsible on UN level? This would be one question. And the other is, you mentioned these the investigations of the ICC on the war crimes before 2005 in Darfur, and one let's say phenomenon was that the surrounding African countries were not supporting the indictment against al-Bashir, because by that time it was said that the ICC is somehow Western or somehow white or racially biased against black leaders, and so Bashir was able to travel to different countries in Africa without being extradited to Den Haag. Is this still affecting, let's say, your work, that there is a skepticism against the UN as a allegedly Western white project?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I can only confirm that that is the case. When we were being established, you could see it was difficult to get the support of African countries or Arab countries, because in Africa, it's like Africa solutions for African problems. That's what you hear a lot. Unfortunately, and I would really support it, I really would, but the problem is there is no real African solution. We're trying to work as much as we can with the African Union, but even the African Union is not necessarily like a representative of Africa. There's that issue as well. So there's definitely a kind of emphasis on sovereignty over like international cooperation. The ICC, I think, has struggled with its reputation from the beginning, because most of the conflict areas that they were looking at were African areas. Of course, some of them were brought to the ICC by the states. So there's a lot of nuances that were not really mentioned in the debate. But I think this is definitely in the new geographic like reality. This is a reality. Of course, like my team, our experts, like two of them are from Africa, one is from the Middle East, and the whole team is from the Middle East. So I mean, it's generally speaking very, very, very good mix. But yeah, this is something that we're all struggling with, and I think also for the future, it's going to be difficult and very important for that we really include these neighboring states and as well as Sudan. There is a bit of a move, because I think there's a lot, of course, there's a regional conflict, so there's a lot of hands in there, and that makes it also very difficult. But there's also countries that are quite tired of Sudan, and you see they're more like South Africa, and there's like other countries that are actually moving more towards an international solution. And for me, it should be the UN and the African Union together if you really want to make something happen.
Was more or less the same question to you. What would be your expectation that the information that you are gathering, the evidence, who is supposed to practically take it up and do something with it?
Well, maybe just to top on what Caroline has mentioned. Yes, there are so many challenges actually when it comes, for example, to this international jurisdiction or having, the cases before the International Criminal Court. But unfortunately for the Sudanese victims, actually it's the only way out. Because actually, they have been waiting for more than 30 years, and now actually they have added to these 30 years like more 5 years. It become like 35 years, to see the justice, within their own country. Because the perpetrators are free and actually they are with them in every single step, without having any one of them actually to be persecuted before this national justice. And that's why the impunity still exists. And also this is why, most of the peace agreements that has been signed in Sudan, at different areas and levels also have just, collapsed after it has been signed, because the question of accountability is not there, and the compromise between the political leaders, whether actually they are the civilians or even the military components who negotiate the peace agreements, actually they just end up to have this blanket amnesty in order to move forward with the political settlement. And I think this is really very dangerous and really very serious. And that's why the victims are left with only one option, to see the justice within the ICC. Yes, there are so many challenges. And even, some influential countries like United States or Israel or even Russia recently, they imposed like sanctions against the court, and also they intimidate and they threat the judges and their families. And I think this is really very serious actually to come from certain democratic countries, to undermine the international justice. Okay, so the African leaders, they have the right to say that, no, this is not our business and it's not our piece of cake. This is a white tool, against us as African leaders. Okay, because they simply, give them the examples that, okay, no, we are not going actually to be subject to any of the norms of this Rome Statute or the International Court because we are big. So also this is really very, 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 very serious. But however, I think this data or this evidence that has been collected, actually it's really very needed, because even this international jurisdiction is not supported by only those two countries. I think there's a number, the rest of the world, the rest of the moral world, I think they are supporting this international justice by way or another. And even if it's not today, actually it could be tomorrow. And even actually within our country itself, this is actually not the end of the game, because we believe that actually at some point, there may be, a change, towards a democratic civilian-led government, by which actually we can utilize all this data and all this evidence that have been collected by these regional fact-finding missions or the UN missions, or even by the different NGOs and CSOs that have been working on this field. Even after so many years, I think it would make a change. Whenever, for example, we apply like a transitional justice, after we have ended this ongoing war, and at some extent, for example, we managed, for example, to move forward with this transitional led government. So it could be a chance even for transitional justice. But transitional justice actually within our context, not the transitional justice, that give like blanket impunity, blanket amnesty, to those perpetrators, or to be on the favor of any political deal, but rather actually to be for the favor of the peace itself, when the victims actually see the justice served. So that means we ensure that actually there would not be repetition to the war again. And the crime of the genocide that has been committed in Darfur most recently actually has been repeated because there was no accountability. It has been committed in 2000s, and now the same people, yes, from different angle, different perspective, but actually the same people, the Janjaweed militias and the Sudanese armed forces who committed the genocide in 2003, now they commit it again in 2023. This is because there's no accountability. So the information actually and the data and the evidence could be used at some point, whether nationally or internationally.
Before we open for the audience, I would have a very short question related to this. There has been cases where perpetrators had been brought to court on the basis of universal jurisdiction in national courts. Also African perpetrators, also in Germany. My question would be, have you been, the African Center, been in contact, or have you been addressing national governments with the question whether their country would be open to launch an investigation on this basis of universal jurisdiction?
Well, yes, it is. Maybe within the region, I mean, within Africa, it could be like a bit tricky or a bit difficult, as Caroline has mentioned, because actually a number of them actually are not that cooperative. Maybe the only ideal that we have in Africa could be like South Africa. But even South Africa actually has been examined actually during al-Bashir, as you have mentioned, because al-Bashir, he was indicted, and South Africa was a state member to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the sitting president who was indicted actually has visited this state member party, and then he left the country, you know, without being arrested or surrendered. But from our own experience as the African Center, we have such an experience, but actually it's related to the business. I mean, to some companies and some incorporators, you know, who has actually facilitated the transaction of money for the previous regime, you know, in order to access the international arms market. And mainly, actually, this is a bank called BMP in France. So we file a case against this bank with Justice Expedite project, International Federation for Human Rights, and we, the African Center, and we filed the case actually in France. And the investigation has opened 2 years ago, and it moves actually in a very progressive way. And also there was another case actually in the United States against the same bank, but against individuals. So far, actually within Africa, I think it's not visible. However, I think if they, for example, move to any of the European countries, because we have like a case in Sweden, and I assume that, for example, even in Germany, I mean, these countries, you know, which have a rule of law, actually, it could be much more visible. But in the region or the Arab, Middle East or North Africa, it's not visible at all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We do have one big block left to speak about, which is the future, the perspective for transitional government, transitional council, transitional order, and the possibilities to support grassroots organization in Sudan. But since we've been talking quite a while now, I would like to open it for questions from the audience now. We could maybe collect a few and then try to reply on them in a joint way. Sie können die Fragen auch auf